Hello, fight fans, and welcome to the Combat Challenge podcast. My guest today is a middleweight athlete with 15 professional fights to his name and is signed to the prestigious Cagewarriors promotion, and he trains out of Next Generation under the guidance of head coach Mr. Paul Rimmer, Mr. Matthew the Beast Bonner. Matt, thank you so much for joining us, my brother.
Pleasure. Happy to be doing it, mate. I'm really looking forward to it.
The first question I've got to ask you, my brother, is the fight name, The Beast. Can you share with us where that came from?
This was from an old coach. He was trying to get me an MMA fight at the time. And he rung up either the promoter or the manager of the guy who was meant to be fighting or possibly fighting. And the guy said, "We're not fighting Matt Bonner, he's a beast." And that was that then. That kind of stuck. I mean, they always say you can't pick your own nickname, so he kind of chose the nickname for me. But the problem being, there's a lot of beasts out there now. There's tons of them. There's Ashley Reese, who's the beast. There's Eddie Hall, who's the beast. Derek Lewis, who's the beast. So it's I'm one of many, unfortunately. But hopefully I'll be the best beast in a few years' time. Brother,
there's all these beasts, right? But I don't want you to copy anyone, especially the guy who decides to take off his shorts because his balls are hot.
That's right, yeah. I'm going to stay away from. I don't think I'll be doing that after I beat James Webb in the next Cagewarriors. I'll stay away.
Now, brother, if you can share with us your martial arts journey from a young age, what sort of sports you got into, who you trained with, and how you ended up where you are now.
Yeah, sure. I started when I was 10 years old. And I've got a twin brother, so I think we'd both finished football training at the time. We'd had enough of the football training and we'd stopped. And it's not that we lived in a rough area, but we certainly lived in an area where there was kind of a lot of young lads flying around. And I think my mum turned around one day and said, I think you should try some kind of combat sport. Warrington, I live in Warrington. Warrington's very well known for having lots of Thai boxing gyms. Always has been, for whatever reason. It always seems there's quite a lot of world champions that have come out of Warrington in the past. So that was kind of the obvious direction that we went in. And we did it. We loved it. And kind of did that for, I think, about 5 or 6 years. We did just Thai boxing. And then we left. We ended up moving from Warrington to Wales, to North Wales for work. And that's when it was the first time, I say we, because I've got a twin brother as well who also does it. First time we saw The Ultimate Fighter, the reality TV show. Because obviously back then, you're probably talking at least 12 years ago now, MMA still wasn't the mainstream that it is now. It wasn't the kind of the big force it is. So we saw The Ultimate Fighter and again, loved it and decided that's what we wanted to do. We wanted to try around at MMA. And then the problem being in Wales at the time, there's no gyms, there's no MMA gyms. You'd be lucky to find a kind of a judo gym in North Wales at the time. So we had to do our driving lessons, pass our driving test by a car, and we managed to drive down to Wolfslair gym where Michael Bisping was, and yeah, we trained there for probably, I think that must have been 4 or 5 years possibly. Yeah.
Wow, and is that at the time where Rampage was and Mario Socata and them all?
Yeah, I've known Mario for at least 12 years, yeah. Bisping was there, Rampage was there, Czech Congo was there. You had all the Americans who used to fly in and do the training camps, and it was a good place to be fair. But obviously we were just amateurs at the time, so we possibly we weren't around the pro athletes as much as you'd like to think you was. They did the morning sessions and then we'd be in the evenings. But obviously, like you've mentioned, Mario Sukata, he was still our coach, and for the most part, we really enjoyed training there.
The thing with that place was, at that time, brother, there wasn't anything like the Wolfslair, was there?
That's right. It really was one of the biggest gyms at the world at the time. Again, we watched Ultimate Fighter and Bisping pops up, and that kind of, he was your avenue then. If Bisping could get on the Ultimate Fighter and Bisping could make it to UFC, then that would give everybody else afterwards a little bit of hope that maybe they could head in the right direction. Because before Bisping, there was Lee Ramidos and there was Ian Freeman, but not on the scale that Bisping kind of brought to the UK scene, not even close.
Yeah, because Ian, he did it a little bit later on in life, didn't he? He didn't start MMA when he was young.
That's right. He must have been mid-30s to late 30s when he fought Frank Mir, I would have thought. Where Bisping, as we know, was in his prime. He's gone on to be the UFC champion and be really successful with his kind of commentating afterwards. So he's still well, I would say by far the biggest thing that's come out of the UK.
Yeah, for sure, man. I think because he originates from, I think, Clitheroe in Lancashire, and then he ended up going there.
Right. Yeah, that's right.
Wow. And Lee Remedios, I remember watching him on UFC, right, against Genki Sudo. Do you remember that fight?
Yeah, that's right. I've not seen the fight, but I remember I believe I've seen kind of like highlights of the fight, but Genki Sudo was a beast, wasn't he? He was one of a kind.
There's levels in there, brother. I mean, Lee Remedios was good, but Genki Sudo was just on a different level. And I remember watching that fight. And the first thing I remember when they clinched belly to belly, and he did one of those throws straight over and ended up in side control. And I think at one stage, Lee Remedios got on all fours, and Genki just did like this spin on his back, and whoomp, right. And it was like a rucksack straight on his back, and game over, man. That was just madness the way he moved.
I think it's kind of good to look back on those shows and see how far the UK's come. Even with kind of wrestling ability, we've caught up, and maybe not caught up, but we're catching up. Maybe we are. Certainly, you see the younger generation. Their wrestling is unbelievable. Some of the guys who I see Next Generation, where I train now, and the wrestling is very slick. And they've got kind of a base in wrestling as well. Especially the guys who come from kind of Wigan way in Southport. That's where they were doing the wrestling, and they are kind of the MMA fighters. They've not come from a Thai boxing background or a wrestling background. They started doing MMA when they were 12, 13 years old, and you can certainly see that now.
Well, in places like Wigan, that's where they do that catch as catch can wrestling, don't they?
That's something else I've done before. We had a catch wrestling coach down at the gym from the Snake Pit, which is the big kind of catch wrestling gym in Wigan, a guy called Greg Crompton. He was a really nice guy. And then I've also wrestled or been coached by Charlie Bowling, he's more kind of freestyle wrestling. He's won kind of bronze at the Commonwealth and stuff like that, and done really well for himself. So it's good that we can kind of take these people from the wrestling and introduce it to our game a little bit more.
And from the Snake Pit, Mr. Wood, I forgot his first name, the guy who was running it.
Ron, what's it called? He's a bit of a legend, actually, but I forgot his name.
His daughter, Andrea, runs it as well.
That's correct, yeah, that's right.
Yeah, the way I know that is because they got in touch with me to do some MCing for them at one of their shows, and they were like Ian the Mongoose Jones there and other people that were competing there. John Hathaway from UFC, he were there.
That's right. Yeah. I watched the show. I ended up watching the event because Greg, the guy I was talking about, competed on it, and I think he won the world championship there. Yeah, you're right. Good guys, really strong guy, tough as nails as well. The stories Greg will tell you, they are tough as nails.
So you must have been at the same show that I was at then?
I was watching it online. I was watching it online because they had a feed direct online, so I was watching it online. It was a good show, actually. It was quite entertaining. I think Josh Barnett was there, wasn't he? Or was that the one before?
No, I think it was either the one before or after, because he drew against Ian Jones on one of them.
That's right. Yeah, that's the one I watched. Yeah.
Yeah, he drew with Ian Jones, yeah. It's a small world, isn't it, brother, this MMA community, right?
It really is, yeah. Yeah, it is.
So when you went to Wolfslair, obviously at some stage that closed. Can you tell us your journey from there, how you ended up at where you are now?
The Wolfslair ended up, I don't really know what happened. There's kind of a lot of theories that went around, but essentially it was burnt down. For whatever reason, it was burnt down, it was closed. And then we ended up going, there was a Thai boxing coach there at the time called Brian Austin, and he, off the back of Wolfslair burning down, opened up his own gym in Widnes. So we went there for 2 or 3 years with Brian. Did a little bit of amateur stuff there. And then we've eventually, funny enough, bought the gym off Brian. We own the gym. Yeah, that kind of ended up being ours. Yeah, we again mixed results. You'd win some, lose some, and whatnot, and that's kind of the reason why Dan went back to Thai boxing. He kind of fell out of love with MMA, and then excelled so well in Thai boxing that he stayed there. But then after, it was always the case of what was always missing was the sparring partners and even the coaches to a certain extent. We're talking about kind of like Paul Rimmer and some of the coaches that we've got at Next Generation. They are absolutely world-class coaches, and they're always in the thick of it. They're always learning, always picking up new things, and that makes a massive difference. Bri did the best he could, but Bri was working 8 hours a day, and then he'd do 2 hours of training or coaching in the evenings, where there's about 5 coaches at Next Generation who are there all the time. That's their full-time job, and you can't really compete with that in regards to kind of running a gym where, again, you're doing it for 2 hours on at the back end of your normal job, and then maybe a few hours on the weekend as well.
What year did you end up going to Next Generation and start training there?
I've not been there very long. I've only been there. It'd be 2 years in June and July that I've been there, and I think I've had about 6 fights. So I've kept quite busy, considering that the lockdown probably took about 6 months off that as well, or 4 to 6 months. The first time I went into lockdown, so I've not been there very long. But I kind of feel like I'm 10 million times better than I was 2 years ago, and I think you can see that in the fights as well. You mentioned at the start I'm kind of 15 fights into my professional career now, but I feel like it's only the last 2 fights where I've really kind of made an impact and felt really comfortable and confident in there, and that is from sparring, good guys at Next Generation, and from being around, like I mentioned before, world-class coaches. It does make a massive difference.
For sure. I've had 1 or 2 fighters on the podcast. I've had Paddy the Baddy Pimlet. That guy's a character, isn't he?
He is, and he's kind of, it is funny, Paddy, because for anyone who's not trained with Paddy or not been around, and you think, oh God, look at this guy. He's a big mouth. He's got this big crazy hairstyle and all the rest of it. But he can talk the talk, but he walks the walk as well. He is probably to this day the best black belt that I've ever rolled with. He's got me twice with a flying triangle in sparring before, and this is with big clumsy shin pads on and 16-ounce boxing gloves. He is massively talented, and he's also a really nice guy. Again, he's kind of plays the character, when he's on Cagewarriors or after he wins the fights and stuff. But I think if I remember the first day that I went into Next Generation, I think he was maybe the first or second person who came up and welcomed me to the gym. And he was very nice. And I'd actually fought someone from Next Gen previously as well, so that was quite quite nervous. You don't know how people are going to react to you, and he made me feel very comfortable and was very kind.
It makes a big difference, doesn't it, brother? Because you have have to fit in, because that's going to be they're going to shape and mold you through your career as such, right?
That's it. If you don't get on with your training partners, you are better off not being there, to be honest. And same with the coaches. If you've got no chemistry with the coaches, or you don't really want to listen to their advice or whatever, then you're wasting your time pretty much. So
do you commute, or do you actually live in Merseyside?
I live in Warrington. I moved back to Warrington from Wales when I was about, I think it was probably early 20s, 22, 23. So I drive to Liverpool every day, which is kind of like a 30, 40-minute journey. It's nothing, it's not too bad.
I used to go to Warrington. There was the police training facility there in Warrington,
right, okay.
Isn't there?
That's right, yeah. There's a few big police stations in Warrington, to be fair, because they cover St Helens as well.
Well, I used to go there because a good friend of mine ended up joining the police there. And before that, I joined, and I was training in Harrogate, but he ended up going to Warrington. So I used to go and visit him at his training academy. Yeah. Back in the days, brother, back in the days. Now, talking about fights, my brother, your last fight was on Cagewarriors 118 against a well-respected, tough opponent in Matt Inman.
That's right.
Tell me what you knew about Matt leading up to the fight, and also if you can talk us through the fight.
It was a funny one with Matt, because the fight before Matt, I fought a guy called George Smith. Now, George Smith was SBG Manchester as well. He was Matt Inman's main kind of protege coming up. Everyone had this big thing about George is next one to get title shot once he gets past me. And so when I beat George, and then I remember being in the gym. I had a private at that time, a 1-to-1 who was teaching, and I got a text message from Paul Rimmer saying Matt Inman has accepted the fight against you, and I just started laughing straight away. I thought, this is bizarre. It was almost like I'd kind of beat the apprentice, and now his master had come out of retirement to try and beat me up. So I just started laughing my head off. But it was quite tricky with Matt, because he'd been retired for 3 years. And so you're never really sure. You can look back at the footage and stuff, but you're never sure if has he got better? Has he been developing himself? He said he had. He said he was probably, tactically better and technically better than he was, 3 years prior. So it was very tricky. I never it was just very tricky to know what to train for. With George, prior to Matt, you knew he was, slick on his submissions. He was very good. He had, very high level judo, so that was quite easy to prepare for. Where Matt was very tricky because you have no idea what he's been doing for the 3 years prior to, to taking the match up against me. But it was a really good fight. That's a fight that I'm really, really pleased with. I don't know if you've watched the fight, but it was an absolute barn burner, really, for about 3 rounds. I hurt him in the first, and then I kind of won the second as well. And then he started to make a little bit of a comeback in the third. But it was a really good fight. If anyone's got UFC Fight Pass, I'd definitely recommend the watch. I still kind of watch it back here and there. And yeah, I love watching it. It was great.
And were you happy with the way it panned out? Did it go according to what you thought it might end up doing?
Not really, but it wasn't because I messed it up. I figured, and again, this is kind of what I was talking about before, his fight prior to me 3 years ago was against Craig White, who had a kind of short stint in the UFC, but Craig beat Matt in about a minute. He came out and just rushed Matt and just beat him up, and the referee had to jump in and whatnot. And I figured I'd go in and try the same thing. I thought I'll go in, aggressive, a lot of pressure coming forward, and I'd take the fight out of him, but he was super tough, so tough, and I hit him with. That's probably the hardest I've hit anyone in my life. And his face afterwards was pretty awful, but he was super tough. Took everything that I threw at him, and he was still trying to give it me back, even towards the end of the third round. But I was pleased because I said I wanted to go in there and be aggressive, and I managed to pretty much keep that up for the full 3 rounds.
Right, my friend. So, over the years, you've had loads of coaches and mentors that have helped you on your journey. Is there anyone specific that you'd like to mention? And if so, what role have they played in shaping and molding you into the fighter that you are now?
I think the obvious ones would be the guys at Next Gen. And again, this isn't kind of not acknowledging the people beforehand, but I felt it was Next Gen who have took me to that next level for sure. Paul Rimmer. Again, he's a little bit of a genius. He technically is world class. There's a lot of good brown belts, black belts who come out of Next Gen who I talk to, and they say, he is absolutely world class in his technical ability and his thought process. You've got Ellis Hampson as well, who's essentially co-coach there. He's a little bit of an unsung hero. He kind of likes to keep himself to himself, Ellis, but again, he's only young. He's like 25, but he's the guy who he's at the gym all day. Then when he gets home, he's probably watching it all the rest of the day on YouTube. He's very dedicated, and Molly will tell you that. Molly McCann, he is a hell of a coach. Then you've got Sayada there, who's a Thai boxing coach. You've got Nathan Brough, who's my new boxing coach. Who was brought me on unbelievably in such a short amount of time. I've got my main jiu-jitsu coach, Ben Hill, who again is possibly one of the best brown belts in the country at the moment. He's a bit of a killer and strong as hell as well. And then my strength and conditioning coach, Paul Reed. He's again, I had a loss last year in March against a kid called Jamie Richardson, and the first kind of decision I made after that fight was to get a strength and conditioning coach, and that's paid off big time. I'm in the shape of my life, and he's kind of covered all bases there. I'm a lot faster, a lot stronger, and hitting a lot harder because of him. So, yeah, those are the main guys who have kind of, I guess, shaped my career for the most part, or definitely been a part of the career that's gone the best.
You mentioned that Paul Reed, brother. There's a couple of people who I've done a podcast with, and they've mentioned him as well, saying, the not just the strength and condition, but the nutrition side, the guidance. He does some work with Cagewarriors, so he's got a lot of experience, right?
Oh, for sure. He does work with a lot of high level athletes, and every time I go to see him, he's got his gym in his garage. They call it the barn. I call it a garage. It's like could fit about 4 or 5 cars in there. He's got all his equipment in there, but every time you go there, there's another name. Oh, this guy messaged me before, and I'm doing him. And this guy's fighting on KSW, and I'm looking after his diet. So he's becoming very well respected. And like I say, it's just nice to kind of, you'll go to. I go and see him once a week, but then he sends me 2 strength conditioning for the Monday and the Friday, and then I go and see him on the Wednesday personally. But it's just nice to have it all set out for you. There's no kind of divvying around for myself, because, again, that was one of the things that I looked after myself. I did my own strength conditioning. I was managing myself. I was getting myself fights and all the rest of it. And it's just nice to have these guys who can pretty much just take all the aggro out. And I can focus on the training, and they can focus on planning out the training and getting me to where I need to be.
Well, ultimately, that's what you need to do, don't you, brother? You need to have other people managing certain areas so you can just focus on that, right?
Exactly. That's the new thing. You see all these kids coming up. When I say kids, 18 to young 20s, and you've got a professional S&C coach, and they've got professional coaches, and they've got, they're not really, they've not got a day job because they're supported by, other people. The less you need to do, the less messing around you need to do. A big thing now is having your food prep for you. So that's another thing that isn't, to be sorted out by yourself. And these little kind of things that might be only like 5% or something. If you do 6 things that kind of amount up to 5%, that's 30% better that you'll be on the next time you have a fight. So, but again, back in the day when I first started, this stuff didn't even exist, and that's why the sport is going to grow so much, because these guys have just got new levels and new facilities.
I bet back in the days, brother, your nutrition was like a jacket tater with chicken or something.
It was terrible. And again, talking about coaches who kind of did a normal job and then did the training in the evenings, they didn't have a clue. They had no idea. I'd come from away and go straight to McDonald's. And it sounds so stupid when you think about it now. You think, Christ, how could I be so naive? But you're just kids and you didn't know any better. Yeah, you had no idea. And then the good thing about kind of, I suppose, making those mistakes is you learn from them, and we can kind of, I'm talking, when I say we again, I'm talking about me and Dan, we can pass down these little tidbits that we've learned ourselves and what's worked for us, and the people that we talk to, they can avoid all the mistakes that we made.
One of the things I was thinking about, brother, when you were talking about next generation, where that's got you, and the other gym where that got you, the way I was picturing it is, when you were at the other gyms, you were like on the streets and the roads, and you were going on that same journey, but you could do like 30 mile an hour or 40 mile an hour. Then you go to next generation, you're going on that same journey, but you're on the motorway now, so you're doing it 70 mile an hour. Is that kind of how it's come across to you?
That's exactly. Yeah, exactly. It's just a lot more streamlined. At next gen, the coaches, I don't say this in kind of like a nasty way, I mean it as a positive. Certainly for me, they're quite harsh. If you do something wrong, they'll tell you and they'll be on you, and you won't make that mistake again. And that's certainly what I think, I benefit from. I like that critique. I want to be kind of the best that I can be. So for someone to turn around and say, that's not right, you really do need to work on that. That's how you get better. That's how you learn. It might not feel good when they say that to you, but it feels good when you get it right the next time, that's for sure.
Well, that's why they say at gyms, you've got to leave your ego at the door, because if you have ego and stuff like that, that's going to stop you from becoming humble and taking those words of advice, right?
That's right. And I think that's the kind of, again, talking about past mistakes, that's the mistake I kind of made when I went pro way too early. This is kind of the number one advice I give to all my fighters coming up. Do as many amateur fights as you can do. Take all your losses, take all your wins, make all your mistakes, leave your ego at the door, break down your fights, whether you win or lose. I never did that. Again, this isn't me blaming anyone else, but I didn't have a coach to say that either. You're not ready for pro. You need to do this at amateur first. And I kind of made all my mistakes at pro, which is why, I've had quite a few losses, which I'm bouncing back from now. But it's like a hole that I had to dig myself out of. And again, I'm not sure about it was to do with ego, but I wanted to go pro and I wanted to start making an impact on the scene. I clearly wasn't ready for it. And I really could have done with someone to kind of say that and put me in my place a little bit, I think.
Well, when you talk about people and having those coaches and telling you to stay amateur for a while and get experience, I did a podcast with Matt Figlack and Michael Figlack, who are both on Cagewarriors, and also I did a podcast with Paul Sutherland from Trojan Free Fighters, who's their coach. And Paul was saying, and this was backed up by both the Figlack brothers, that he wants at least 10 amateur bouts. So you go through the whole system, know exactly how it feels to get a win, to get a loss, the whole weight cut, etc. And then you're ready, you wipe the slate clean, and then you're on to pro, right?
Yeah, I completely agree. I have guys who come to my gym and they'll say, I want to go pro. They'll say, this guy, No, never had an amateur career. I want to go pro. And you say, you can go pro, mate, but it won't be out of this, Jim. You're not ready, and you need to experience the adrenaline. You need to experience the kind of the weight cuts and whatnot, and the different positions that you're going to be put into. There's not really. I had 10 amateur fights, but I still wasn't ready to go to pro. Or you could have 4 or 5 amateur fights and be dead ready to go to pro. I think it's very dependent on kind of your confidence levels, and again, the people around you. When you lose, have you made the adjustments from the loss? And I think if you have, then that goes a long way to, again, taking that step further into the pro. But yeah, I don't think you can really put a number on the fights in terms of, I'll have 10 fights and I'll go pro. You need to kind of build up properly, and your coach tell you, drag you aside and say, listen, we think you're ready. Let's make that next step.
We're at this testing time, brother, with this pandemic and everything else. How are you able to keep fighting fit and prepare for your next fight during the period that we're in now?
I've been dead lucky all the way through, because obviously Next Generation is probably one of the biggest gyms in the UK. And I've got the elite status, which, Cagewarriors is legislated by the government. So I'm allowed to train. So I'm allowed to drive down to Liverpool and still train as normal. I've also got my own gym. So although I can't have clients in there or classes, I've still got weights and strength conditioning equipment in there. So it's not really, it's not really been a thorn in my side like it has been for most others. I've been dead fortunate. And when the first lockdown happened, I just focused on trying to keep fit, going for walks with the missus and still doing the weights and whatnot. And then when I was allowed, when this elite status came through, I just made the most of it and trained my butt off for it. And yeah, it didn't really make much of a difference for me. I know, a lot of other people struggled, and I've got sympathy for them. But in terms of my experience, it didn't really make much of a difference.
You've had loads of both amateur and professional fights. Out of all those fights, is there any fights that are most rewarding for you? It could be some sort of adversity. It don't have to be a win. Is there any fights that was rewarding? And if so, could you share that with us?
Yeah, sure. The one there's just 2 that stick out for me. One being the Matt Inman fight that we briefly talked about a few minutes ago. That's probably the biggest win that I've had. And, again, I was really pleased with how I performed in that fight. The other one was my first win at pro. It was against a guy you may know, a guy called James Webb, Irish guy from Team Rhino, very good gym. And it was his pro debut. I'd actually lost my first 2 pro fights. I had a terrible start, and he was the third one. And James at the time, again, it was his debut, but at amateur, I think he was number 1 in Europe. So the cards were kind of stacked against me there. I think I was there to lose as far as, I don't know. As far as the promoter was concerned, I think I was there to lose and there to kind of give James a good platform, good start to his career. And I ended up really, I beat him over 3 rounds and used my wrestling, probably for the first time as well. I've been training a load of wrestling, loads of double legs and single legs, and doing the work with Greg Crompton, who we mentioned before, the catch wrestling coach. And that really paid off in that fight. And again, that was the first win. And I had a little bit of a turnaround there. This was obviously before Next Gen, but I ended up winning a few more after that, and then get to Cagewarriors pretty much by myself for the most part. But that was all off the back end of the James Webb win for the most part.
Now, I asked this question from all the athletes that come on, brother, is do you have any sort of like fight ritual, or on fight day, can you talk us through the process that you put yourself through before you enter the cage?
I don't suppose I have so much of a ritual, but I do like to just stay nice and relaxed. I'm not sure about an introvert, but I do like my own space. Certainly when there's a lot going on fight day. So in terms of Cagewarriors, I'll stay in a hotel room for pretty much the whole day. I'll be nibbling away at food and making sure I've drinking the right fluids and whatnot. And then I always take my headphones and think, what I'll do is I'll settle down when I'm there and I'll listen to some music and I'll ramp myself up and never end up doing it. I never even end up taking them out of the bag, ever. I just shadow box, have a little bit of a stretch. And for the most part, just do as I'm told. And and just try and enjoy being there, especially like we mentioned before with COVID and lockdown and stuff. There's possibly one of maybe 200 fighters in the UK who is allowed legally to have a fight. So again, there was a fight I had last year in March against James Richardson, and I lost, and I hated the whole experience. I didn't enjoy it one bit, but the lesson learned from that was just to take the pressure off and just relax, enjoy it. Win or lose, go in and enjoy it and soak it all up. And even the weight cut and stuff like that, just try and find little bits of that to enjoy. And the results have kind of spoke for themselves since then. The more I've enjoyed it, the more I've kind of took the weight off my shoulders, the better I've fought. The better the fight.
Savor those moments, brother, aren't they? Because those are memories you're creating, aren't you?
100%, and then you'll kind of see this when you speak to maybe guys who have retired from fighting, or even guys you'll see on documentaries. I don't know if you've seen a documentary, Mark Kerr, The Smashing Machine, before. And he says when he's in his career, the adrenaline, he hated the adrenaline, he hated the buzz of walking in, and having all the eyes on him. And then when he retires, that's the one thing that you really miss. You miss the adrenaline, you miss having the purpose and waking up in the morning and saying, I have to get out of bed because I need to train for this fight in 8 weeks' time. So for sure, I still feel quite young, and I'm 30 years old, but I still feel like I've just hit my prime. But you just cannot do this sport forever. It is, your body's going to give up or whatever. So that's how I see it. Enjoy it while it lasts, and just enjoy the ride.
Well, I watched both of Mark Kerr's. One was the actual documentary, which was The Smashing Machine. And then later on, when he's a bit older and he's talking about the adrenaline and stuff, that's what you're on about, aren't you?
That's correct, yeah.
Now, on that one, he's a car salesman, and he's saying in order to get that same adrenaline, he kind of shakes himself off before he's supposed to do a sale, and he finds a way to kind of replicate that on a small scale, that same adrenaline, right?
That's right. I think that's the kind of, I don't know about danger, but we see it, don't we, in terms of old boxers or even old MMA fighters who kind of come back well past the prime. Maybe they've had 2 or 3 years off or even a decade off, and they say, right, I miss it, I want to come back, and they're too old and they're too worn out, and maybe the brain's deteriorated to some extent. And, what do you do after your career's finished? I think for the most guys who are fighting, you don't really get paid a lot of money. So you do it because you're passionate about it. What do you do with that passion when you can't fight anymore? You go into coaching, possibly, but not everybody wants to coach. You've got to find something else to kind of occupy your time. And unfortunately, people find drugs and alcohol and other things to occupy the time. It just sends them, they self-destruct.
Well, there's a couple of people that I know who are no longer competing, but they've found their focus in jiu-jitsu tournaments where it's not as strenuous on your body, but you still get that buzz, right?
That's right. That's a good example. I mean, it's funny because I would have said that myself. I would have said, after my career is over, I'm going to go into jiu-jitsu. I'm going to do a few tournaments. I'll be dead relaxed about it. And then once I started working with Ben Hill, the brown belt from Next Gen, and realised how brutal those guys are, I figured, you know what, this sounds even worse than MMA. No, he snapped. He competed against Lewis Long, a Welsh kid, really strong Welsh kid, and broke his leg. And then Lewis Long still beat him. So I guess it would depend on what level you kind of compete jiu-jitsu at. If it's kind of, the local tournaments, then great. That might give you a little bit of a buzz, or you might go with a bit of a medal. But the high levels of jiu-jitsu, you talk about the Gordon Ryans and the Andre Gavalios and stuff like that. Those guys are monsters, and they will rip your spine out, if you get a chance to do it. So I guess it just depends on what level you want to compete at afterwards.
Well, you don't want to come across that dude who loves his heel hooks. What's his name?
The Sparharas, yeah. Yeah, he's a monster, yeah. And he's a nasty guy with it as well, isn't he?
Yeah, he just has this, he literally wants to take it off and put it in his rucksack and go off with it.
That's the kind of nightmare, isn't it? I mean, if those things go wrong, that's 12 months. 12 months of your life in terms of how long it's going to take to rehab and the surgeries and whatnot. And we know that from Dominic Cruz, who had 3 knee surgeries, and the graft. They would take a graft from his hamstring and try and put it in his knee, and that would fail or get infected. And that is something that is something I kind of not worry about, but that is the nightmare injury. That is essentially taking a year of your life away, as far as I'm concerned.
Well, I do a bit of jiu-jitsu rolling, brother. And when anyone goes from my legs and it's a straight log, it's all right. But if they start even going towards my heel, I just tap me because I don't want anything to do that, especially in sparring, because you want to tap, reset, and go again, right?
I do exactly the same. There's some big guys at next generation, guys who are 6'7", 6'5", big, strong heavyweights, and they're not the most technical because they've not, they're still amateur fighters and they've not been doing it for as long as maybe the other guys in the room have. But they are big, strong boys, and even if they don't get the technique spot on, if they're grabbing you by the heel and they're pulling it over as hard as they can, they're still going to rip stuff. So I do the same. I just tap straight away and give them a pat on the back and say, that was a really good heel hook. But in the back of my mind, I'm like, yeah, you ain't ripping that today. You'll have to wait for another time to do that.
Well, the danger with heel hooks is, even if that person don't rip it, you're trying to get out. You could cause damage yourself, couldn't you?
Yeah, that's right. You're essentially turning into your own heel sometimes. So yeah, that is the danger. But again, tap, live to fight another day mentality. That's what I kind of live by, I guess.
Now, your next fight is confirmed on Cagewarriors 121, which will take place on 19th of March, so it's only like a week away, against James Webb. What's your preparation and what do you know about James Webb, and how do you think the fight will play out?
James is tough, and again, he's kind of a level. He's a level above, which, you win the fight, you'd hope that you fight a guy who's a level above. James was the Cagewarriors champion until he got beat by a guy called Natis Frederick. For anyone who's going to be a Cagewarriors champion, you know that they've got some legitimate skills. I think in terms of what he brings, I do think he's quite limited in terms of his all-round game. He's very good at his jiu-jitsu. He likes to wrestle. He likes to do quite a lot of work on the cage. And you'll see that. That's no secret. That's not me giving away the game plan. You'll see that on every single one of his fights. His striking's quite poor. He's quite fit. These champions have to fight 5 rounds, so he can go 5 rounds comfortably, or as comfortable as 5 rounds are. But in terms of the training, I tend to, certainly at the start of the camp, is just work on getting me better. Any weaknesses that I've displayed in the previous fights, I'll try and tighten them up for the most part. And then maybe when you are getting closer to the fight, that's when you'll specialise in kind of exploiting their weaknesses, or James Webb's going to go for a takedown. How am I going to defend this takedown? Kind of mentality, but. Yeah, it's been quite fun to prepare for, really. The camp's gone ace. I don't know. It's kind of one of those things everybody says, but it's been the best camp that I've ever done in my life, for sure. And I'm really looking forward to, like you said, it's next week. It's 7 days away, and I can't wait.
And hopefully, once that fight's done and dusted, you'll come back and we'll have another podcast, my brother, and we'll talk about that, if that's okay.
Oh, for sure, I'd love to. Yeah, I'd love to. Hopefully, after this fight, I'd like to think, I'm kind of one step closer at Cagewarriors world title. I don't think there's anybody else who's fought the competition I've had. So hopefully, next time I'm on, we'll have some good news, and I'll be fighting for the belt.
You've had loads of fights, both at amateur and professional. If there's athletes who have competed at amateur and they're thinking of going professional, from your years of experience, what sort of advice would you give to those athletes who are wanting to go professional that you've learned through your experience and knowledge that you could cascade down to them?
The first thing I'd say is kind of question your motivation for going pro. Why are you going pro? Is it because you want to be a professional athlete and you want to work your way to the UFC? Is it because you want to make money? Because you ain't. For the first kind of 5-10 fights, unless you make a big statement, you're not making any money at this level. Certainly not enough to kind of support yourself. So I think first, kind of question your motivation and question if are you doing it because you want to look good on Instagram, or are you doing it because you've got a real passion for the sport? That's what I'd say. And again, talking about back in the day for me, even when I was amateur or pro, there was never any money ever involved in MMA. Thai boxing is even worse. You'll fight on some of the biggest shows in Thai boxing and get 500 quid for it. So that would be my first kind of thing to think over. The second one would be just to train your ass off. There really is no substitute for just getting in there and putting the time in, and just being very kind of selective about your training in terms of, are you kind of going in the direction of what you're good at? If you're a good boxer, are you boxing all the time? Should you be boxing all the time? Should you be working your takedown defense or your wrestling? MMA is a very tricky sport. You're almost kind of spinning 4 or 5 plates at the same time, or you should be. If you're a good boxer, look at your weaknesses, take advice on what your coach thinks you need to work on. And the last one, I guess, for me would be make sure you're in the right place. It's no good kind of doing what I did and being naive. If you want to make it to the UFC, you've got to be in the right gym for it, and you've got to be surrounded by the right people. And that doesn't mean you have to go to one of the biggest gyms in the UK, like Next Generation or MMA Academy or something like that, or Aspire, whatever else is in Liverpool. It just means the guys who are coaching you have to have some kind of credentials. Either they fought at a high level before, or they've got a history and experience where they've trained other people at high level. Seek those people out and don't be naive. Nobody gets to the UFC these days by coaching themselves and by managing themselves. You need to be very professional about how you approach your own training.
Matt, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and experience with us. And I look forward to hopefully having you on the next podcast, hopefully a couple of weeks from now, my brother.
Been a pleasure. Really enjoyed it. And like you said, after this fight and hopefully after the win, we can get back in contact and have another podcast. I'm looking forward to it.